Welcome to Austin Liti Limits, a series where authors talk to authors about books and writing. I'm Scott Simmergren.
And I'm Larry Brill. You know, Scott and I have had our share of successes.
And awards.
His last novel, To Squeeze a Prairie Dog, won 3 book awards. His latest novel, The Benevolent Lords of Sometimes Island, has been getting great reviews.
Larry has won his share of awards too. His latest book is out now, The Printer and the Strumpet. Here at Austin Liti Limits, we're working with our good friends at Book People to introduce readers to our favorite authors.
Well, naturally, during these days of pandemic, we've had to move our author interviews online until the bookstore is up and running again 100%.
In this episode, I had a chance to sit down with author S. Kirk Walsh.
Kirk was born outside of Detroit, the youngest of 4 kids. She developed a healthy love of sports at an early age, both in and out of the water, and for 2 years was ranked the #1 player in the little-known sport of platform tennis. Think paddleball meets Wimbledon. She has been widely published in the New York Times Book Review, Long Reads, Story Quarterly, and Electric Literature, among others. Kirk is the founder of the Austin Bat Cave, a writing and tutoring center that provides free writing workshops for youngsters throughout Austin. The Elephant of Belfast is her first novel.
Please welcome to the show, S. Kirk Walsh.
Hi, Scott.
How's it going?
It's going good.
So how was it releasing a book during the pandemic?
Well, it wasn't too bad. I feel like, my book was published April 6, 2021. And so my publisher Counterpoint had a year to kind of adjust to the reality of the pandemic. So I felt like they kind of had the formula down by the time my book was released, and realized that, like they kind of said, do 6 or 7 online events. Just so that I wouldn't, as you know, like being on screen a lot can get a little tiring, but I actually was surprised by the sense of community and just feeling connected to people that I felt despite, being in my office most of the time. I would say one of the highlights was going down to Book People and signing my books the week that my book came out. And there was about 160 books, and maybe 100 of them had been pre-ordered. And I knew almost every person who had pre-ordered the book. And so it almost felt like a book party, the pandemic version. But it was very, I felt this unexpected moment of support and generosity. So it's been unusual. It has been strange. I won't deny that. But, in the fall, I should be able to do some in-person events. So I'll get to have that experience too.
Right. We're going to be back at Book People in the fall in our studios.
Yeah.
That'll be great. So here's your book, The Elephant of Belfast. Fantastic, beautifully written book. And it takes place in Ireland in World War II. And I understand that you had a long gestation period for this book. And also, you hadn't visited Belfast initially. So can you talk about how you initially primed your imagination to write this book? And then second, once you visited Belfast, finally, how did that change your writing process and what you were doing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question about sort of how I prime my imagination, because I felt like it was a lot of different things. And, I think as writers, we have these ideas and we don't quite know what's involved when we start. And so with the idea itself, I had heard about the Elephant Angel, Denise Austin, who my story is inspired by, on the radio. Not her physically, she died by then, but the story of the Elephant Angel and the zoo, they had discovered her identity. And so a lot of radio stations all over the world were broadcasting this kind of feel-good story of a woman saving a 3-year-old elephant during the Blitz. And my family comes from Ireland, but from the South. And my dad and my uncle were very heavily identified by their Irish Catholicness. And I always knew I wanted to write something set in Ireland because of my family's roots. And, this story took me up to the north, which is a more complicated place. And, I think kind of my inroads in terms of time and period were more like the ideas of the book. And I had read right when I was kind of beginning to think about the book and, questioning, like, can I do this? I had read Let the Great World Spin by Colin McCann, and then Netherland by Joseph O'Neill. And both of them are Irish writers, and both of them were writing about September 11th. Mm-hmm. Let the Great World Spin was a little bit more sideways, but I think reading those books kind of made me feel like I could write about Northern Ireland as an American. And I did, and I can talk about this a little bit more later, but a lot of my experience or how I wrote about the war, I did interview survivors of the Blitz, but I drew from my own experience of living in Manhattan during the attacks of September 11th. And, as I began to do research, I saw that the scope of the violence was quite similar in terms of the number of casualties, the unexpected nature of the attacks. And so I think for me, I was really thinking of this as like a 9/11 novel. So
I was thinking about that because I had read that you lived in Manhattan at that time, and I vividly remember 9/11. And I was thinking about that when I was reading your novel, that there are some parallels there as far as I imagine you were thinking back at that time and walking through the streets and, the debris and the people and the things that were happening. So I'm sure there was some connective tissue in your imagination there, right?
Yeah, and I think, there's definitely images in the book related to memorials. In this case, some are related to the animals, but I lived on the Upper West Side, and there were memorials all over, like on street corners and foyers. And then, downtown, St. Paul's Chapel was transformed into a site for recovery workers to get a break from working on the site. And I was, St. George's Market, which is a market at one point, and then it becomes a morgue later. The grief was public. And I was interested in exploring the intersections of private grief and public grief. So I feel like I did, in terms of the actual period before I went to Belfast, I wrote a lot from historical photos. And, the Belfast Zoo has historical photos related to the elephant story. The Belfast Telegraph, which is the main newspaper of the city, has a lot of historical images. There's a organization called the Northern Ireland War Memorial, and they were one of my primary contacts. But even before, they have a lot of resources related to World War II. So I definitely was doing my internet sleuthing
sure.
as I began to write. But one thing that my friend Elizabeth McCracken had suggested to me, I started the book before we went to Belfast, and she had said, why don't you just try to write a draft before you go so it can live in your imagination versus having the story be so informed by your trip. And that was really helpful just because, I wrote a zillion drafts of the book, but just to have that first draft and a sense of the story and its possibilities, before I went to Belfast, because Belfast was a great trip and I learned so much and the people were incredibly generous. And it did change a lot after the trip, but it was helpful just to kind of have a sense of what I wanted to write towards and what I was interested in the story.
So once you did have the visit to Belfast, then I imagined, like in The Wizard of Oz, when it turns color, I imagine that your story did change for you in your mind and the process of how it came out afterwards. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like
Yeah.
immediately after the trip, coming back, sitting down at your keyboard, then what happened with you?
Yeah, I definitely was a little overwhelmed. And I will say, I know I'm going to be teaching a class about research in the novel for us in Batcave, and I've been thinking about my research and kind of what was most kind of vital and valuable about it. And what happened when I went to Belfast is I met people, and those, besides like words on a page, like meeting those people really gave me a lot of fuel to keep going during the writing process because it was long. But before I even got there, I did reach out to John Hughes. He's since passed away, but he worked at the Northern Ireland War Memorial, and he basically set up interviews for me with Blitz survivors. And I arrived at the museum, and on the conference table they had the sort of what you would expect. They had tea set up and cookies, and after we had a cup of tea, he's like, "All right, let's go." And he put me in his car, and he took me to Vance Rogers' house, who was 90 at the time. And that was really an important moment for me because he was 17 when Easter Tuesday happened, which is the main bombings in my book. And he was in an office building, being a fire watcher downtown, and his house was destroyed during the Blitz. And, he described to me riding his bike through the debris, which I do use in the book. But more importantly, hearing him talk about the experience, it confirmed that I could draw from my experience of being in Manhattan. Like I felt how he described the air and the smells and the ashes and the unexpected, papers drifting up north. And so that was really like to meet him in person. And then at the museum, I was able to read newspapers from the days that followed the Blitz, which was really important just because the news was being a little censored at that point, just to see what was being published.
Excellent. I have a passage that I marked in your book that I want to read and then just get your take on this, because I thought it was a very interesting pivot point in the book. It's later in when after the destruction of the bombing. So the passage says, several more people continue to walk around them, their arms full of personal belongings and cherished items. It was as if the sighting of this unusual pair, which is Hetty and the elephant, was customary on Antrim Road, as if the bombing had recalibrated daily life into a different kind of normal where anything was acceptable, including a young elephant lying in the middle of the public road during broad daylight. I thought that was very fascinating, like as a narrative strategy, right? Like you're announcing the weirdness of what's going to happen is now normal. So can you talk about that for a bit, that part?
Yeah, it's interesting that you picked that passage because I do kind of experience, that as one of the pivots in the book. And I was writing from a pretty specific moment in New York. So a couple days after the attacks, as I said, we lived on the Upper West Side, and I'm a runner. And back then I'd run on the Bridle Path, and a lot of people were congregating in Central Park, I think, as a respite from the shock of what had happened. So the park was pretty crowded, and I would run up around the reservoir and circle back, and I was circling back. And just as I was kind of coming up from the reservoir, a horse was running towards me without a rider. And it was this kind of moment of suspension where I was like, of course, there's a horse running free. Our city was attacked a few days ago. And it did feel like this recalibration of anything was possible now. And, it probably lasted 10 seconds. It felt a lot longer. And the police corralled the horse, and then I kept running, and about a half mile later, I saw that the rider had been bucked and she was on the bridle path. But I didn't know when that happened, like, oh, this is going to inform this novel about an elephant on a road and a young woman. But I did, as I got into the book and kind of how do I make it believable that an elephant would be walking on a road. And I was like, oh, I had that experience, like something similar. And, to be able to use that moment of kind of, it does feel like suspension. And I think like one of the things, and I tried to capture this in the novel, and this is what I experienced in New York, was that grief was very external. And, it was not, seeing strangers crying on the street was very common. Running into neighbors crying was really common. And
right. I saw a really fun thing on your website. You have a Spotify list of music that appeared in the book, and also you had mentioned it as inspiration. And when I was writing my novel, or I started actually prepping to write The Benevolent Lords of Sometimes Island, I had created a list of pop songs from 1986 because I wanted to think, what were the kids in my story listening to? And they weren't listening to, like underground indie stuff. They were listening to very popular music. And I listened to that playlist quite a few times while I was prepping to write that book. So what was it like for you listening to some of that music? Were you listening to it during the writing session, or just initially in the research part? Were you thinking, well, what was popular at the time?
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I thought about that, and like hearing how to describe your novel, and like in a way you kind of created a soundtrack for your narrative. And I think for me, I came up with the Spotify list just like a month ago or something. Like,
I see. Mm-hmm.
so I hadn't really put together a playlist. And I think for me, like the music in the book, and this was once again kind of drawing from September 11th, was kind of trying to find ways to bring levity and kind of joy. And so I wanted scenes with music and singing to kind of offer that for my characters. And so like, one thing, I had a very good friend who has since passed away, but he was an opera singer. And I remember being on the corner of like West 71st Street in Columbus. Once again, it was the week after the attacks, and someone had handed out, slender candles with those paper skirts, and it was a vigil. And my friend, broke out in song, singing the national anthem, and many people joined him. And I think I was sort of, reaching for those moments that how music changes a space and changes a character. And so the songs, the Floral Hall, which is a dance hall in the novel, does exist. And the woman who my character, Stella Holiday, is based on a real character named Delia Murphy. And so she did sing through the night of the Easter Tuesday bombings, but she was down in Ulster Hall, which is in downtown Belfast. She wasn't up at the Floral Hall, but I had to move her up there so Hetty could experience it. But that was, something in my research when I read it. I was like, oh, a woman singing, she sang through the whole night until the bombing stopped in real life. And I thought that was an extraordinary act.
So what stage of the writing process do you like the most? Do you like first draft? Do you like revising? Do you like final edits? Where do you get the most excitement when you're writing?
Well, with this book, I did do a lot of drafts, and I had 2 revisions where I cut 100 pages and wrote 100 pages. So I would say in those, it was hard to do that. And I was making up more, I think, particularly during the second time I did it. But I like it, the process when I have some constraints. Like I've already made some major decisions around structure, POV, scope, but new things are still happening. So like in those drafts, like I had a reader suggest to me to introduce a character like Eliza Crowley, to create a counterpoint to Hetty up at the zoo. And that, like Eliza, I just got lucky. Like that person had made a couple different suggestions of how to do that. And she just sort of came to me. And then later, the nuns also kind of came in a later draft. And those were like two totally surprising moments to me, made up for my imagination. So I think like I trusted the material enough. I trusted my command of what was going on in the book to kind of make more things up. And I think that was exciting. Like, there's that famous quote from Flannery O'Connor where she says, if you're not surprised during the writing process, it's unlikely your readers will be. And, it's always hard to get to that point of being surprised, because I know for me, or even like beginning this, or I've been working on this new project for a while, but I'm still sort of trying to make decisions, and I want control of the world. So it's like that moment where you can kind of let go and let the characters kind of come to you, I think is my most favorite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find when I'm revising, that's when a lot of the narrative threads kind of present themselves, and sometimes things will pop up and I'm like, oh, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great idea, especially once you've kind of gone through it a few times. I think the revising for me is where kind of like the magic happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're putting the clothes on the skeleton and it's kind of turning into something. That's my favorite part.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this is the time in the show where we do the lightning round. It's 10 questions that is inspired by Inside the Actors Studio. Although it's not their concept, they stole it from Marcel Proust, who stole it from Bernard Pivot, or one of those things. A lot of people have used this format. But are you ready for the lightning round? Ask Kirk Walsh.
Yes.
Okay, what is your favorite word?
Incandescent.
Ooh, I like that word.
Yeah.
What is your least favorite word?
Ill.
What turns you on?
Birds.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah,
what turns you off?
Greed.
What is your idea of happiness?
That's a good question. I would say like being open to curiosity and learning, and having that be an active part of my day.
I like that answer. That definitely brings me happiness. Who is your favorite author?
Edward P. Jones.
Okay. If you could be a character from a well-known novel throughout history, any novel, who would you want to be?
Oh, I need to think about that. Can we come back to that one?
Sure, we can come back. What profession other than your own would you want to attempt?
Baker.
I'd like to be a brewmaster. You and I have similar interests there. What profession would you least want to do?
A politician.
Okay, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the check-in desk?
Hello.
Very brief. All right, so let's go back. Well, what's the character you would want to be in a well-known novel?
Well, I guess To Kill a Mockingbird was one of the early novels I read, and Scout. I liked her kind of spunk and perseverance, and I think a lot of we all have Boo Radleys in our life in different ways. So
that's true.
Yeah, so she's sort of a pretty, I think, classic book that a lot of people refer to probably.
She Scout and Charlie Bucket. Those are two that I've heard quite a bit from a lot of authors.
Yeah, I think because it was like the first. I wasn't actually a big reader as a kid, and I think that was one of the early books where I was able to be transported. So.
Excellent. Well, S. Kirk Walsh, thank you very much. Your novel, The Elephant of Belfast, beautifully written novel. It's fantastic. and good luck in the future.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.